Ethan stood at the edge of the stage in the small high school gym in rural Indiana, his heart pounding so loudly it felt as if everyone could hear it. The morning sun had just begun to slip through the tall windows, casting long rays of gold across the polished wooden floor where families and friends sat in neat rows. He adjusted his cap and took a steadying breath, reminding himself that he was ready. He had rehearsed this moment inside his mind for weeks. When the principal cleared his throat and called his name, the room fell silent, a hush that made every whisper seem as loud as shouts. Ethan stepped forward, feeling the weight of his empty family seats at the front, his father's cold stare and his mother's trembling hand clutching a single photo of a happy family long gone. He remembered how just moments ago his father had stood, voice low but clear. "Ethan Carter is not my real son, and as of today, I will offer no more help with college." The words had cut through the air like a knife and left Ethan with exactly the opening he had waited for. Now, as he stood alone under the bright lights, he reached into his gown pocket and retrieved a plain white envelope, its edges worn from being held so tightly. For 2 weeks he had carried it everywhere, sleeping with it hidden under his pillow, and today he would finally reveal what was inside. He placed it on the podium and paused, letting the tension build until he thought the entire room might burst from holding its breath. Then he cleared his throat and spoke, voice strong, though his hands trembled slightly. "You have all heard what my father said," he began, eyes sweeping the audience. "He told me I am not his blood and that I have no right to his support, but we live by facts and evidence." He lifted the envelope with one hand and gently peeled it open, the thin paper crackling in the stillness. "Inside this envelope is proof of my real place in this family," he continued, his voice steady. He pulled out a single sheet of printed paper and held it high for everyone to see. A DNA report from a certified lab, stamped with a clear seal. "This report confirms that I share 100% of my DNA with the Carters. I am your son, Dad, whether you believe it or not." Murmurs rose in the crowd as Ethan carefully laid the report on the podium next to the envelope. His mother's grip on the photo loosened, and the woman sitting beside her gasped. Ethan let that moment pass, then said quietly, "But there is more you did not know." In the inside pocket of his gown, he had another envelope, this one bulging with hotel receipts and credit card statements spanning the last year. He retrieved it now, sliding it open to reveal a stack of yellowed papers. "These receipts show the weekend you claimed to be in Indianapolis closing business deals," he told his father, voice soft but sharp. "Instead, you were in Chicago, at a hotel room registered under Mom's maiden name." He let the words sink in as he placed the papers atop the DNA report. "You moved pictures of her out of our living room and replaced them with new photos of your new wife as if she had always been our mother." A few heads turned, and Ethan saw his father's face go pale. Ethan pressed on, pulling a small recorder from his pocket. "And this," he said, pressing play. A tinny voice filled the room, his own voice from a late-night library recording. "I know what you did, and I'm gathering proof." His classmates jerked their heads toward the podium as the recording crackled. "You told Mom you loved her, but you were spending nights with someone else." Ethan paused the recorder. He drew in a deep breath, then straightened the papers in neat piles on the podium. "I have the video footage from our home cameras showing unmarked cars pulling into the driveway at odd hours." He clicked a small device, and the gym lights flickered as a projector screen descended. A single still frame appeared, a shadowy figure entering the Carter home at midnight. Gasps rolled through the crowd. Ethan did not hesitate. He knew the moment was perfect. "These are my final pieces of evidence," he said, voice clear. "You tried to humiliate me here today, at my graduation, thinking I would break. Instead, you have broken yourselves." He looked his father in the eye, and for the first time he saw something other than anger or disappointment. He saw fear. Ethan closed the recorder and gathered the papers, sliding them back into their envelopes. He lifted his chin, feeling a calm pride. "Thank you all for listening," he said quietly, and with that single, powerful sentence, he stepped aside. The principal, pale and trembling, handed him his diploma. Ethan lifted it in his hand, smiled at the stunned audience, and walked off the stage into a future he would build with every truth he had revealed. Ethan walked off the stage and into a whirlwind of stunned faces, the echoes of his revelations still vibrating in the air like an electric charge. But he felt an odd calm settle in his chest as he stepped down from the platform. Every eye followed him as he navigated through a sea of classmates whose jaws hung open and teachers who exchanged frantic whispers. And outside the gym doors, reporters and parents clustered to capture every detail of the spectacle. Yet Ethan's focus remained clear, his mind replaying each moment of the carefully planned unveiling that had begun with the white envelope in his hand and ended with the shattering of his father's carefully constructed reputation. For while everyone else panicked, he already knew exactly what would happen next. His father would scramble to regain control, his mother would sink into a hollow silence, and the entire Carter household would be forced into a crisis of their own making. Which is why Ethan had arranged for a trusted friend to take photographs and record the entire ceremony and upload the evidence to a secure online folder, set to release automatically in 15 minutes should his father attempt to delete or destroy the physical copies. As he emerged into the bright Indiana sunshine, he spotted his best friend Jake waiting by the school bus loop. Hand held out with his phone poised to document Ethan's exit. And Ethan gave him a small nod that said everything would be all right, because it already was. He had given his speech, revealed the DNA report, exposed the hotel receipts, played back the midnight threat recording, and triggered the projector footage of late-night visitors. But he had saved his strongest bombshell for last. A notarized copy of his grandmother's will, which named him the sole beneficiary of her estate on the condition that he never be estranged from the Carter family. A clause he knew his father had deliberately ignored when he cut off Ethan's college fund, believing that wealth and lineage mattered more than blood and love. Now, with that document in his hands, Ethan had the power to demand the truth be acknowledged in every official record. And he relished the moment he would watch his father's face pale once more when told that disowning Ethan would also mean forfeiting his claim to grandmother's trust, which was far larger than the college money he had so callously revoked. But for now, Ethan walked calmly past the crowd, letting the murmurs swell and grow into outright chatter. Knowing that reporters would quote his every word and that social media would explode with clips of his speech, but also knowing that the legal power in his grandmother's will would turn his dramatic graduation into an irreversible turning point in the Carter family saga. A few steps later, Ethan's mother, tears staining her cheeks, approached him in a daze, still clutching the faded family photo, and Ethan reached out, gently taking the frame from her grip and setting it safely in his backpack before slipping a comforting hand onto her shoulder, whispering simple words of reassurance. "It's okay, Mom. I did what I had to do," and saw her shoulders relax just enough to let her breathe again. Behind them, his father stormed out of the gym, arms flailing, shouting Ethan's name. But an undertow of shame and confusion pulled him back, and he merely stood for a moment in the doorway, face ashen, before turning and disappearing down the corridor. Probably to seek counsel from his lawyer and strategize how to spin this catastrophe into something resembling control. Though Ethan knew better than to believe any spin could survive the weight of the documents now floating in every newsroom. By the time Ethan reached his car, parked under a maple tree in the school lot, his phone buzzed with messages from classmates and teachers alike, some offering congratulations, others demand-ing interviews. "Tell me how you felt when you opened that envelope," one reporter pleaded, while another simply typed, "What bombshell did you save for last?" And Ethan thought about how he would answer them, but instead only smiled and replied, "All in good time." Then slipped the grandmother's will into his backpack next to the DNA report, feeling the reassuring heft of paper and ink against his side, and climbed behind the wheel of his old Honda Civic, its paint chipped and faded. And as he started the engine, the deep rumble seemed to echo the turmoil he had ignited. But instead of fear, he felt hope coursing through him. Because for the first time in his 18 years, he held the power to rewrite his destiny on his own terms. He backed out of the space, careful not to dent the door, and merged into the slow-moving parade of cars leaving the campus. the hot July breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass through the open window. And he watched in his rearview mirror as his mother slipped into the passenger seat of his father's black SUV, her face pale but determined. And he realized she would join him soon, choosing her son over the life her husband had offered to anyone but Ethan. And that knowledge filled him with a quiet triumph, more potent than any public spectacle. For while his father still controlled the family fortune on paper, Ethan now held legal proof of his place in that family, and a secret clause that would seize the entire trust if anyone tried to keep him out of it. And that clause would ensure he would be looked after even if his father's pride tried to close him out. So as Ethan drove away from Westfield High School that afternoon, carrying the whispers of 1,000 stunned onlookers in his wake, he felt not the weight of revenge, but the lightness of freedom. Knowing he would step into tomorrow's challenges, armed with truth, evidence, and the unbreakable bond of a grandmother's love. And that was the greatest bombshell of all. Ethan drove away from the school parking lot with his heart still thundering in his chest. But he felt a strange calm settle over him as the late afternoon sun dipped low over the cornfields lining the highway. He knew the immediate shock of his graduation speech was only the first act in a drama that would play out in courtrooms, boardrooms, and living rooms across Indiana. And he was ready for what came next. Because for the past 3 months, he had not only gathered DNA reports, hotel receipts, home surveillance footage, and his grandmother's will, but he had also quietly obtained bank statements showing his father had secretly siphoned college funds into offshore accounts under a shell company he created, thinking no one would ever trace the money back to him. Ethan had that paper trail too, hidden in a secure vault at the county clerk's office, accessible only with his lawyer's permission. He planned to use this as his second bombshell when his father tried to sue him for defamation, because Ethan had already filed a countersuit alleging embezzlement and fraud, complete with sworn affidavits from the private investigator who photographed the shell company's accountant meeting with his father in Chicago, where they discussed moving assets away from Carter Family Trust. And Ethan had also obtained email exchanges between his father and the accountant discussing how to quietly remove any mention of Ethan from legal documents, which would not only prove malicious intent, but also criminal conspiracy. And he kept those emails on a flash drive hidden in his glove compartment, right next to the grandmother's will and the DNA report. As he rounded a curve and Indian paintbrush flowers flickered at the roadside, he thought back to the way his mother's eyes had shone with relief and pride when she climbed into the passenger seat of his old Honda, leaving his father's SUV behind, knowing she was finally choosing the child who had always loved her more than he had. And Ethan felt a surge of both gratitude and righteous indignation, for he had sacrificed his final teenage years working extra shifts at the bookstore to pay for the legal fees his mother could not afford, saving every penny so he could ensure those bombshell documents would be airtight. And he had done it without his father's knowledge, slipping the payments into an account under a pseudonym and using a prepaid legal service. And that alone showed how completely Ethan was willing to go to protect both his future and the truth. He knew that when his father's attorneys tried to leverage divorce proceedings against him, threatening custody of his mother or visitation rights, they would not expect him to have preemptively filed a motion to freeze all family assets until the fraud case was resolved. A maneuver he had learned from late nights reading legal self-help books and watching online lectures by law professors. And that motion would ensure his father could not liquidate the grandmother's trust or remove any funds from the college account until the court heard his evidence. And this effectively stripping his father of any leverage he thought he had. Ethan glanced at the dashboard clock as he merged onto the rural highway, feeling the weight of his next move pressing on him, even as he relished the taste of victory. Because he knew the worst was yet to come. The media frenzy would focus on the DNA drama at first, but once they uncovered that his father was under federal investigation for financial crimes, the public would turn against him. And Carter Family Enterprises would plummet in the local markets, costing his father not just his pride, but his entire livelihood. And Ethan would watch as the man who tried to discard him at graduation had to watch his own world crumble, piece by piece, while Ethan built a new life on the solid foundations of truth and justice. A few miles down the road, he spotted the turnoff for his mother's new apartment complex, a modest brick building that replaced the mansion where so many dark secrets had been born. And he slowed the car to turn in, envisioning the conversation he would soon have with her about what lay ahead, because she needed to know that his final hidden bombshell was yet to be revealed, a notarized confession from his father's former business partner, who had agreed to testify under oath that Mr. Carter had intentionally misled investors, used family funds to cover personal debts, and conspired to manipulate stock prices. And that confession would surface at the shareholders' meeting next week, broadcasting his father's deceit to every stakeholder in Carter Industries. Ethan felt a shiver of anticipation at the thought of standing before that boardroom, calm and composed, while his father's partner laid out his crimes in precise, undeniable detail, watched by lawyers, journalists, and investors who had once admired him as a pillar of the community. And that would be the moment the entire Carter empire collapsed, all set in motion by the brave teenager his father tried to reject. And Ethan knew that after those revelations, his father would have nowhere left to turn. He pulled into the parking spot outside the apartment building, engine idling, and he took a moment to steady himself before stepping out, placing the drive containing the partner's confession into his jacket pocket, alongside the emails, bank statements, and every other shred of evidence he had spent months collecting. And he felt the satisfying heft of his briefcase, physical proof that he held his family's fate in his hands. As the door to the apartment lobby slid open, Ethan inhaled a breath, scented faintly with fresh paint and new carpeting, reminders of the clean start his mother had earned, and he smiled, knowing she would meet him at the entrance, clutching her purse, but also clutching a copy of the restraining order she had filed against his father 2 days ago. Another hidden bombshell that his mother and brother had coordinated to ensure he could not harass or threaten them again. And Ethan had quietly paid for the filing fees out of his own savings, ensuring it could not be overturned by any temporary court order. He reached for his phone as he crossed the lobby and saw a notification that the secure folder with all the ceremony videos and speech transcripts had been accessed by reporters in 3 different states, ensuring the story was already trending nationally under the hashtag #TruthWins. And he felt a spark of vindication as he thought about those journalists racing to update their headlines, unaware that he had another, more devastating revelation waiting for them next week. The lobby door slid open, and there was his mother, eyes bright and determined, and Ethan stepped forward to wrap her in a careful hug, whispering, "We're safe now, Mom." And she exhaled, burying her face in his shoulder, as if she finally believed it. And in that embrace, Ethan felt the weight of all the hidden revenge bombshells he had unleashed and the freedom they had bought. Knowing that while the road ahead would be challenging, he had already won the battle for truth, and that victory would carry him far beyond those rural Indiana cornfields into a future he would forge on his own unbreakable terms. Ethan left his mother's apartment behind him and stepped into the early evening air, the sky painted in streaks of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the cornfield horizon. And as he walked toward his battered Honda Civic, he felt the weight of every revelation he had unleashed settle into a quiet determination to see justice through to the end. Because while his father's public humiliation and the collapse of Carter family enterprises were already guaranteed by the evidence he had released at graduation and the testimonies he had lined up for the shareholders' meeting, there remained one final gathering to secure his future and ensure his father could never again harm him or undermine his place in the Carter legacy. The Carter Family Trust hearing, scheduled for next Thursday at the county courthouse in Indianapolis, where he would appear with his lawyer to petition the trust to enforce the clause his grandmother had written in 1998, binding any disownment attempt by his father to an immediate forfeiture of all trust assets into a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. And he had already prepared a full dossier, complete with affidavits from the lab technician who ran the DNA test, notarized receipts for the hotel stays, sworn statements from neighbors who witnessed the late-night visitors, the flash drive of his father's partner's confession, and the legal filings freezing all trust assets so that when the judge reviewed the case, he would see an unbroken chain of documented truth, stretching from the hospital rooms where Ethan's mother first held him as a newborn, to the polished podium at Westfield High where Ethan had stood his ground. And he knew that the Carter Family Trust would have no choice but to redirect the entire principal of the trust, millions of dollars, into the scholarship fund his grandmother had envisioned, thereby cutting off his father's ability to access any further funds, while compensating Ethan indirectly through the educational opportunities it would provide to so many others, which was precisely what his grandmother would have wanted. And in that knowledge, Ethan felt both vindication and peace, for he understood that his victory would benefit more than just himself. As he reached his car, he saw flashing lights and a pair of local news vans pulling into the lot. Reporters knew he would emerge here, the scene of his dramatic retirement from the Carter household, and they would want his reaction to the impending hearing. But Ethan decided to stay silent until the courthouse steps, letting the suspense build and ensuring that when he did speak, every word would carry the weight of the documents he held. He slid behind the wheel, careful not to scrape the paint, and as he started the engine and pulled away, he thought of the conversation that awaited him with his father one last time, because despite everything, he believed in the possibility of redemption, and he had drafted a letter to Mr. Carter asking him to attend the hearing and witness the enforcement of the trust clause in person, so that he could face the consequences of his actions openly, rather than through proxies and newspapers. And while part of him feared his father would refuse and hide behind lawyers, another part hoped that seeing the extent of his own ruin might finally break through the pride that had caused so much pain and led to genuine remorse. The drive to Indianapolis felt both short and long, the hustle of small towns giving way to suburban sprawl and then to the glass towers of the city. And he thought of the pride he once felt growing up knowing his father was a respected businessman, and how that pride had turned to shame and then to fuel for his quest for truth. And as he approached the courthouse, with its towering columns and wide stone steps, he felt the unmistakable hum of history in the making. Because this was not just a legal hearing, but the culmination of months of careful planning and a testament to the power of evidence and perseverance in the face of betrayal. He parked in the public garage across the street and walked briskly, briefcase in hand, past colleagues of his father's who now wore expressions of pity or awkward avoidance as they recognized the teenager who had brought their golden boy to his knees. And he remembered the words his grandmother had whispered to him years ago when he first began to suspect something was wrong. "Truth is stronger than any lie," she had said. And those words had guided him through long nights of research, every painstaking step of gathering receipts and recordings and statements. And now those words echoed in his mind as he climbed the courthouse steps and entered the hushed marble lobby, where a long line of people waited to file paperwork and attend hearings, including his father's attorneys, who immediately spotted him and slid into conversation in low tones, pulling out tablets to review the filings they undoubtedly recognized as Ethan's. And Ethan offered them a polite nod, but did not pause, determined to maintain his composure because he knew that control of the moment would belong to the person who appeared calmest when the judge entered. At precisely 5 p.m., the bailiff opened the courtroom doors and called the case. In re Carter Family Trust Enforcement, Ethan Carter, petitioner, versus David Carter, trustee. Ethan rose smoothly along with his father, who entered a moment later looking like a man in a suit 2 sizes too big. His shoulders slumped, his tie loosened, and Ethan thought he had never looked smaller in a courtroom. As they stood before the bench, the judge, a stern woman with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, peered down at the files in front of her, and then at Ethan, then at David, and said, "Counsel, are we ready?" Ethan's lawyer spoke first, outlining the petition to enforce the trust clause, summarizing the DNA results, the will provision, the freezing order on assets, and the supporting affidavits, while David's attorney made a half-hearted objection to the admissibility of certain exhibits, which the judge overruled after a few pointed questions. And in the quiet that followed, Ethan felt the momentum shift irrevocably in his favor. The judge asked Ethan directly whether he understood the implications of the clause. If enforced, all trust assets would bypass his father and go into the scholarship fund. And Ethan replied simply, "Yes, Your Honor. That is my grandmother's wish, and I ask the court to honor her intent." Then she turned to David and asked if he wished to testify or present evidence. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, and David swallowed and shook his head. His voice caught in his throat, and the judge nodded, saying, "Very well. The court finds the provision clear and enforceable. The trustee's attempt to disinherit the beneficiary constituted a breach of trust. Therefore, under Article 6 of the trust instrument and applicable state law, the entire trust corpus shall be allocated to the Carter Family Scholarship Fund, effective immediately." A hush fell over the courtroom as the weight of her words sank in. David looked as though he might collapse, his eyes locking for a single moment on Ethan's, a mixture of sorrow and dawning respect flickering in them. And Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, not from anger, but from the bittersweet relief of vindication. The judge then signed the order and excused the parties, and Ethan gathered his papers and briefcase and, without speaking, turned and walked past his father out of the courtroom, feeling the gaze of everyone on him, but experiencing only a quiet triumph. For he had not only won his own freedom, but had secured a future for countless other students in need, just as his grandmother would have wanted. And as he stepped into the late evening light, he realized that while the courtroom victory would be recorded in legal annals, the true victory was the knowledge that he had stayed true to his values, upheld the power of truth, and transformed a day meant for shame into a lifetime of possibility. And that was the final, unspoken revenge bombshell. By honoring his grandmother's legacy and the power of justice, Ethan had become far more than a son defending his place. He had become a guardian of truth for a family and a community that needed it more than anyone had imagined.